Right, South African Human Rights Commission KwaZulu Natal Acting Provincial Manager Pavershree Padayachee joins us now for more on their findings. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time and coming on. I've had a look. I mean, in the 5 days or so, you would have spoken to professors, academics, you've spoken to Abahlali baseMjondolo, you would have spoken to the ratepayers associations, you spoke to the Kokda MEC at the time, you spoke to a various number of municipalities. So all these folks would have come in and made their contributions. What would you say would have been the consistent thread or line in terms of why they were consistently failing to provide good, clean water constantly all the time?
I think that the main, one of the huge challenges remains that the municipalities finds that their budget is insufficient to cater for the existing and growing demand in the various communities. One of the issues we found is that in terms of the KZN Water Master Plan, municipalities are supposed to provide or keep aside 8% of their budget to be able to run operations and deal with maintenance issues. And this is something that has not been happening across the municipalities. And this is what's led to the major crisis in relation to the lack of access to water in the province.
Yeah. Now, of course, the violation firstly resides with the fact that it is a human right for residents, citizens of the country, constitutionally, to be provided with water. But there is a basket of other rights that you're saying would have been violated by this failure to provide this service. Just expand a little bit on that finding.
So in terms of the rights affected, the right to access water is covered in terms of international prescripts as well as the Constitution and other statutory provisions. The right to water also impacts on the right to human dignity, which is a very intrinsic right, and it also has an impact on the right to life, which, as we know, water is an essential commodity that people cannot do without. Having no access to water breeds, various diseases. There's an issue around lack of hygiene, particularly in relation to women and girls. There's a very gendered perspective. There's a whole host of rights that get affected when access to water is a challenge.
Yeah. And it's very clear from your findings that you're saying there is no lack of water resources, I suppose is what you're saying, but there is certainly poor planning, poor budgeting, exacerbated by a lack of skills with regards to the provision of this service. What did you find? What did you find in practice, for example, would actually be happening at a district or a local municipality when it comes to forward planning, when it comes to, I mean, you've already mentioned the 8% reserve that has not been put in place, but when it comes to having the kind of skills that are required?
Well, in terms of our findings, there's been many issues that we've uncovered. Like you've alluded already, there is a lack of skills. There's a lack of essential expertise to deal with the challenges, infrastructure related. There's a lot of leakages, burst pipes. These are not being dealt with effectively, which causes a huge challenge in the system. Apart from the infrastructure challenges and poor planning, there are various issues in terms of, we do know KZN is a very water-rich province. The challenge is that we've not been able to harness this resource, this precious commodity, and be able to spread it across the province to all those affected communities who are unable to access water either via standpipe or through taps, for example. So there's various challenges within the municipality. I think the issue of expertise is a challenge. The poor planning, one of the very major issues is infrastructure. So there's no or very little work done in terms of building or repairing the current infrastructure. Many systems are very close to collapse, and the situation is so dire that the amount of funds that are required to repair damaged infrastructure or aging infrastructure is colossal. And that is why you find constant and persistent issues that are facing certain municipalities. You know, one of these municipalities would be the Ugu District Municipality, for example. The challenges are so vast, and the cost implications of the infrastructure challenges are so extensive that it's an ongoing problem, and therefore you find the residents of Ugu are acutely affected throughout the constant basis of access, no access to water, which is such a huge challenge.
So, Ms. Padayachee, how would you characterize that? For example, if you would ask maybe some of the officials that tell you, maybe I might not be an engineer, for example, I might not have that particular qualification, but I've been an accountant, or maybe I've been a manager or director at a high level at companies, so I've got experience in terms of management, I've got a wealth of experience in terms of navigating spaces of leadership. What would you say would have been fundamentally lacking in the skills that were required here?
I think it's one thing to be in management, but the technical skills and the expertise in that arena is quite critical, and we can't compare it with a vast amount of management experience. The sort of technical engineering and other expertise in terms of skills is at a shortage, and this is one of the areas that municipalities need to also invest in.
Yeah. So when you go to the extent of saying, in most instances, this would be an indication, particularly at the municipal level, of dereliction of duty. That is in most instances a fireable offense, would you say?
I think we have to deal with each. It is quite a serious statement, but I think we have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis per municipality. In terms of the challenges that have been raised by the municipality, you know, relating to budget, lack of staff, lack of skills, and so forth. And yes, it is a dereliction of duty. It is a violation of constitutional rights. There are various issues that are at play and involved in this challenge.
And this dereliction of duty, is it in any way addressed? Are people being held accountable?
I think there's various elements to these things. There are certain things that the Commission will deal with, and there are certain aspects in terms of dereliction of duty that we may have to refer to other more appropriate organizations. But you will find from our report, which will be available, is currently already available on our website, that our findings and recommendations are quite extensive, and we may not have the opportunity to go through each one at this point in time. But there is certainly very many aspects that would deal with this and many of the other challenges.
But when you're saying in general and in particular, the overarching sense that you're getting is that there is a reluctance to deal with non-performance, which I would say dereliction of duty would fall under that. We'll talk about the corruption aspect. But if you're saying there's a reluctance to deal with non-performance, give us an example of what you would be talking about there. The Auditor General would give you an example of something like a CFO that would use consultants instead of putting the books together, the basics of the books. So to say this person obviously can't even put the simple books together, and they've got to spend millions to get a consultant to come and do that for them.
I think this happens across the board, not necessarily only with municipalities. There are very many instances where you find consultants being appointed without proper processes being complied with. There are various audit issues in this respect. And I think these issues ought to be dealt with internally via the municipality. Where there is a reluctance for these issues to be dealt with, then obviously there's an oversight role that needs to be played, be it by the KZN legislature, provincial government, and other role players. In relation to the allegations of corruption that you alluded to, those are more specifically suited to the Office of the Public Protector, which would deal with maladministration, corruption issues, and the like.
Yeah. You cite some 3 water services associations, for example, that have a tariff structure that is incompatible with the operations and the maintenance costs. In fact, you're saying in most instances is quite lower than where it should be in certain areas. How is that explained?
So particularly, it really relates to the water services boards, and there it's been the Mshlatuza Water Board, the Utukela Water Board, and the Mgeni Water Board, which have it's Mgeni and Utukela that have now merged, and you really find that the Mgeni Water Board has low tariffs in relation to the rest of the country. We do find in terms of the tariffs that there are disparities in the amounts and the rates being charged. We've had residents that have come across even within Ituqueen municipality, for example, that have alleged that they are being charged much higher amounts than certain other parts of the country and the province.
And how are these matters being addressed? Particularly when you look at how this inconsistency in water supply is affecting business. Maybe let's start by saying how is business experiencing this inconsistency, and how is it probably impacting on the local economic development?
I think obviously in instances where the water tariff is excessive or much higher than it should be, there is a significant impact in the business sector. The economy has had serious challenges since COVID, and this has had a serious impact on the financial implications of various businesses. But I think there's various issues, because in some instances you would find that the lower tariffs which are being charged also have a corresponding impact on the municipality and its ability to operate and function optimally. So there are sort of conflicting issues to consider in this regard.
Yeah. The tankering situation and how it's being carried out, you're finding some fault in that, and what are the issues? Why is it something that you would have flagged?
So in many of the municipalities, we found that the tankering system doesn't have a regular schedule, and many communities do not have access to these tankering facilities. The tankering facilities go to municipalities on a very irregular basis. Very often the water provision that is provided in terms of tankering is insufficient to cover the needs of the community. Very often they get to certain parts of the community and the tanker is already empty. There's also the issue of corruption in relation to the water tankering services, and there have been allegations of officials being involved with the tankering services where either they're involved in the tender process or they are involved in the companies that actually are outsourced to provide water provision, interim water measures via the tankering services. We've also had instances where complainants and communities have made allegations that the tankering service meant to go out to the communities have actually diverted to other areas. They have even went so far as to suggest that these tankering services were diverted to homes of councillors and certain politicians and so forth. Yeah.
And overall, I mean, how did the South African Human Rights Commission in KwaZulu Natal ensure that these type of findings or this report would not be challenged, I suppose, in certain quarters to say, well, we were not given a voice, it wasn't an extensive enough, there are certain areas or aspects that were not considered that we would have made a contribution on, and you're having adverse finding, for example, on our local municipality without a due consideration of things like spatial planning and how that would be affecting the availability of resources and township development in these particular areas.
So the issues of spatial planning, township development and so forth have all been taken into account. You will find certain elements of our report have these sections already covered. In terms of the process that the Commission has followed in the inquiry process, we have called all of the water services authorities, which are 14 water services authorities, as well as the Water Services Board before the inquiry. Most, if not all of these authorities and municipalities have appeared before the Commission. They've provided their testimony before the inquiry panel. They were given opportunity to respond to questions. There was a further process in which we at certain times may have required clarity on certain submissions of evidence at the inquiry. At this juncture, the Commission had also provided the affected municipalities with an opportunity to respond to the Commission with further clarity in writing after the inquiry process had closed. There were some municipalities which had responded and some municipalities had not. By the time we had issued our preliminary investigative report, this was shared with all municipalities, all water services authorities, and affected communities. And they were given a specific time period within which to respond with their comments and input, particularly in regard to issues that they may wanted to have dispute, raise concerns with, and so forth. We had not received any material comments in this regard, save for one municipality, and that municipality's contributions and input was considered, and it was implemented into our final investigative report. So we have fully covered ourselves in terms of the process that we have followed. All voices have been heard. We have heard the challenges and given all parties an opportunity to present, their submissions.
And in your recommendations, which, of course, we know that the recommendations of Chapter 9 institutions must be enforced and must be adhered to, what are some of the low-hanging fruits that would immediately begin to turn this situation around, especially at maybe municipal level, but what province also needs to do in this instance?
So you would find, like I said earlier, our recommendations are quite extensive. There has to be a lot of ongoing engagement with the provincial government and the oversight bodies such as the KZN legislature, the Department of Water and Sanitation, and COCTA as well. For the Commission, what is very important is for us to secure interim redress or interim measures for those communities, particularly who currently have no access to water. And here we look at interim measures either via means of JoJo tanks, water tankering services, standpipes, and any other sort of interim measures that can bring relief on a temporary, short-term basis to communities, while the more long-term challenges are being considered.
So, we had the COCTA minister the other day here, and we put the question, for example, on grants. And she says there's no problem with grants. Grants are being allocated. Grants are being allocated to municipalities as per need, and if the need is more than what the grant is, the next financial year it's readjusted and so on and so forth. So the question is not about whether grants are being provided by National. National provides those grants. One of your recommendations is leverage the municipal access to grants. How do the municipalities in practice do that?
So one of the things we found during our inquiry process is that many of the municipalities haven't really made their motivation and requests for the specific grants. Some of the municipalities have been advised to do so during the inquiry process. It is an important element in terms of them being able to deal with their financial challenges. A lot of the water challenges is also based on non-revenue water, which is a huge challenge for many municipalities. But what we have found is that many have not been accessing the grant options as they should be, and we have advised the respective municipalities in this regard.
Yeah. Intergovernmental relations are a little bit of a complex issue. For example, again, with the minister, we asked why, for example, doesn't COCTA jump in instances where, for example, right now a whole entire province would have had such an adverse finding. And she says, well, the best that a minister of COCTA can do is write a letter, request a report, look at the report from the other arm of government, and send a recommendation, because that's just how our laws are in the country. National cannot, by any means, just walk down into province and make decisions for them.
I think the bottom line is, be it national or at provincial level, we need to hold people to account. And that's where we need to start if we want to see access to water in the province improving. And sometimes there are many instances where we find there's also a lack of political will to move these and certain other issues in the province. So it's an issue that we grapple with in the human rights arena, and it is something that we need to pursue, where we really need to be transparent and we need to really hold people to account, including the respective officials and the provincial and local government wherever necessary.
Is there something more that probably would need to be articulated as far as legislation and the use of something as placing municipalities under administration?
Look, I think placing municipalities under administration can be quite effective. It just would depend. Sometimes you'd find, for example, Msunduzi has been placed under administration several times. It hasn't made a significant difference in the improvement of access to services for the residents of Msunduzi municipality. So sometimes it does work and sometimes it doesn't. In such instances, perhaps there are other sort of remedial effects that might be necessary. You would find sometimes, and we've discussed even today, the possibility of strategic impact litigation. There are various other avenues that can be followed, but litigation is quite effective, and sometimes it is quite necessary as well.
So, I mean, when you speak of strategic impact litigation, what would you say to a tactic or strategy that would have been taken, for example, by the Westville ratepayers in how they are approaching a lack of service delivery, where they say, well, we'll not necessarily not pay, but we will withhold those payments, put them in a trust until such a time we reach an agreement with the municipality on how services would be improved?
So I think it's difficult for me to comment on that one without having sight of the papers in that particular application. I'm not sure that two rights would make a wrong in terms of not paying for services and demanding access, although I do share the frustrations and the concerns of the affected residents. I think what would be helpful is to pursue litigation in such a matter in the right course by instituting the relevant applications with all supporting documents and so forth. I think perhaps withholding payment could further exacerbate the situation, and it may not necessarily be the right cause. But here again, it's difficult to comment without having sight of the papers in that particular matter.
All right. Pavershree Padayachee, National Acting Provincial Manager for the South African Human Rights Commission in KwaZulu Natal. We thank you for your time and for joining us this evening.